Welcome to 321 exams. Today we shall be taking a look at a new topic in biology called reproduction. In our previous topic, we looked at excretion. So today we shall be taking a look at reproduction. And also, we're going to discuss in details the objectives of reproduction. So let's take a look at objectives of reproduction in biology. One of the objectives we're going to consider is to differentiate between sexual and asexual reproduction. Sexual and asexual reproduction. Organs and structures involved in sexual reproduction. And then number 3, shall be taking a look at the similarities between asexual reproduction. And then we shall be taking a look at the meaning of reproduction. So this brings us to the definition of reproduction. So reproduction is defined as the ability of a living organism to give rise to new individuals of the same species in order for the continuity of life. Now, it is very important that organisms should be able to reproduce, otherwise the organisms will go into extinct or extinction. For that not to occur, reproduction is a very important phase in the life of every living organism. Now, reproduction can be asexual or it can be sexual, depending on the category or class of organisms. We shall be taking a look at types of reproduction. The types of reproduction are basically asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction usually occurs within organisms that are classified as invertebrates. Of course, we all know that invertebrates are animals without backbones. Animals without backbones are known as what? Invertebrates. While sexual reproduction occurs mainly in vertebrates. So we shall be taking a look at these types of reproduction. So some of the types of asexual reproduction are stated here. We have the runners, the bulbs, tubers, budding, binary fission, fragmentation, regeneration, cloning, and these are some of the types of asexual reproduction that takes place in plants as well as vertebrates. Now, one of them is the spore formation, which was not mentioned. Spore formation. Spore formation usually occurs within organisms that are very, very microscopic. For example, the Plasmodium species usually form spores. And of course, the main spore-forming organisms are called the bacteria or the bacteriums, or rather, the bacteria. Bacterium is for singular, bacteria is for plural. Spore-forming bacteria such as endospores, or they are endospores that causes, they are resistant to so many types of weather conditions like heat and hot temperature. So organism, for example, a germinated endospore goes into sporulation, forming two spores. These two spores will develop to form three spores. So the spores themselves begin to divide. One spore will form other spores, and then they will begin to divide into several kinds of spores, and then they will be released into the environment, and a lot of spores will be formed within the environment. A very good example, like I said, is bacteria. Bacteria, a class of bacteria, are very notorious for the formation of spores. And those four spores are referred to as endospores. And they are very, very notorious for the resistance of weather and the chemical conditions. So let's take a look essentially at the difference. What is the major difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction? As the word implies, asexual reproduction involve only one organism. Only one organism is involved. Why sexual? Let's tabulate it. In sexual reproduction, two organisms are involved. Here, there is no exchange. In this case, in asexual reproduction, there's no exchange. There's no exchange of gametes. Gametes are referred to as sex cells. They are called sex cells, like the sperm and ovum. In the case of sexual reproduction, there's exchange of sex cells. That is, sperm cell and ovum. Also, number 3, no new organism with different genetic makeup is formed. In the case of sexual reproduction, a new organism is formed. In this case of sexual reproduction, the number of chromosomes that are involved are being shared between two parents, from the male and from the female. While for asexual, the number of chromosomes are the same. So now let's take a look at some of the types of sexual reproduction, which of course I listed them earlier. Number one, we have the binary fusion. And binary fusion occurs in Amoeba. Amoeba and Paramecium are unicellular organisms. They are unicellular microorganisms. Budding takes place in Hydra and Lobelia and yeast. Budding is also a type of asexual reproduction, and it occurs in Hydra mostly. Now I want to say something. Budding is an offshoot of the root of the plant from the body of the parent plant or from the organism. A small structure will just emerge from the surface or the body part of the organism, and that will lead to development of another same type of organism, or known as the the daughter organism, and is usually common with the Hydra. Then sporulation. Sporulation occurs also in Amoeba, so bacteria, algae, fins, and mosses. These organisms are very good in forming spores. They call them the spore formers. Spore formers. Call them spore formers. Also, we have another form of asexual reproduction known as parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis usually occurs in insects. Parthenogenesis occurs in aphids and honeybees. This is a situation where organisms develop to a certain level and then they begin to reproduce without any exchange of gametes. This usually occurs in honeybees and aphids. So parthenogenesis is a mode of reproduction that takes place. Then types of asexual reproduction. Also, we have schizogony. Schizogony, please. This is known as schizogony. So schizogony. Schizogony is a type of reproductive process that takes place in Plasmodium and Merozoites. Plasmodium is a species or is a carrier organism that is responsible for malaria. Of course, malaria is a very notorious disease that affects mankind. And this is usually carried by this Plasmodium. Plasmodium is usually carried by an infected female Anopheles. Mosquito. So Plasmodium species is usually carried by an infected female Anopheles mosquito. There are different types of Plasmodium. We have Plasmodium. There are different types of Plasmodium species. We have Plasmodium falciparum, which is the most common. Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium vivax, and of course the latest one is Plasmodium nulexi. Plasmodium nulexi. So this Plasmodium is a very important organism that is important to man because it is responsible for causing malaria, a kind of disease that causes fever, pains, and other to man. And merozoite is another stage of development of the Plasmodium. That is why the emphasis on that. So these types of asexual reproduction can be clearly seen here. Then the next one is fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs in planaria, sponges, hydra. In planaria, sponges, hydra, coletorids, and algae. We also have natural vegetation. We have natural vegetation, which occurs in plants, essentially. Natural vegetation occurs in plants, and there are two major types of vegetation. We have artificial vegetation and natural vegetation. So on that, we have the runners, the stylons, the suckers, and the bulbs. These are some of the plants that undergo types of natural vegetation. So let's look at still on types of asexual reproduction. Like I said, we have two types of asexual reproduction. I mean, two types of vegetative propagation. So two types of vegetative propagation. There are two types of vegetative propagation. One is natural, and the other is artificial. So artificial vegetative propagation. And these methods of artificial vegetative propagation occurs during cutting, layering, marcotting, bud grafting, stem grafting. So I'm going to explain them one after the other. Now, if you want to plant cassava, for example, you have to cut the stem and put it under, and then bury it under the soil. When you do such a thing, you are doing what we refer to as artificial vegetative propagation. And that artificial vegetative propagation is known as cutting. Now, by placing it under the soil or burying it under the soil in a straight pattern or in a semi-horizontal pattern, that system is known as layering. So, layering, cutting, there are two types of artificial vegetative propagation. Now, when it comes to marcotting can occur where a plant, let's take, for example, you take the husk of coconut. The coconut, you break it into two. That is when we say the husk, the back of the coconut. You can put it around, break it into two, put loamy soil containing water, moisture, and all that, or water inside it, and then cover it around the stem or the stem of a plant, and then tie it around it. After some months, weeks, or months, if you remove the husk of the coconut, you will discover that the branch of that plant has started developing roots. And when that occurs, the part of that stem can be cut off and transplanted to another soil, another part of the soil. So it will now develop into a full-blown plant. Such kind of artificial propagation is what we refer to as marcotting. Then we also have what we call bud grafting or budding. Also, a plant can be introduced, a plant with similar species can be introduced into another plant by cutting the stem of a particular plant and introducing it into the body of another plant. Now, part of the stem can be removed, and then a section of that new plant can be cut off, and then that plant that is removed can then be attached to it and tied around it. So a plant can also, a full-blown plant can also cause another plant that is attached to it to continue to grow from itself. That kind of arrangement is what we refer to as bud grafting or budding. Stem grafting. Stem grafting. We can actually peel sections of the stem, peel it off, and then tie a new plant or stem to it, and that will cause it to also grow. Now, I want us to understand that in asexual reproduction occurs in unicellular organisms and in invertebrates. It's very important we should take that along with us. So now this brings us to sexual reproduction. This brings us to what we call the sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in other unicellular organisms. Not only all unicellular organisms, not only asexual reproduction occurs in unicellular organisms. Reproduction that has to do with sexual reproduction also occurs in unicellular organisms. Take, for example, conjugation. Conjugation is a type of sexual reproduction which occurs in mucor, rhizopus, paramecium, and spirogyra. It is very important because questions may arise, such as what the following organism undergoes sexual reproduction. And once you come across, especially in most exam questions, they always present paramecium as an example. Paramecium undergoes both conjugation and both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So now we're going to be looking at reproduction in flowering plants. Reproduction in flowering plants. Now, before we take a look at the reproduction in flowering plant, let's take a look at what happened. We're going to look at a diagram of an hibiscus flower and then the money rose. Of course, for the purpose of this understanding, we look at the hibiscus flower. Hibiscus flower is a typical flower. Now, many people, if you ask them within the environment where they live, they'll see plants all over. If you ask them, what are these things around? They will tell you it's flower. Basically, after today's lesson, I want everybody to understand that flower is different from the understanding that a lot of people put forward. Flower is a reproductive organ. Let me put it somewhere. So, a flower is a reproductive organ of a flowering plant. It's just like asking somebody, an individual, a full-grown man, what is this man? Or who is this man? You say the man is a penis. It's not possible. So the flower is the reproductive organ of a flowering plant. And that's why we're going to be looking at it today. So the definition of flower is a flower is also defined as a modified leaves consisting of 4 whorls, sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Now, the flower also have those parts that are directly involved in the reproductive process, while the other parts of the flower are not directly involved in the reproductive process. They serve as attractant, that is, things that will cause agents of reproduction to come close to that flower. And the ones that are directly involved in the reproduction in the flower, the parts are known as the stamen and the carpels. The stamen are the male parts, while the carpels are the female parts of the flower. So the male part and the female part of the flowers. The male parts are collectively known as the stamen, while the female parts are collectively known as the carpels. Now, the sepals and the petals are the leaf-like wool, that the wool structures, wool, just like leaf around the flower, that ensures that the flower is held together, and they are responsible for attracting pollinating agents, which we are going to be talking about as we continue to move ahead. Now, the sepals are usually arranged in 3 to 5 wools, collectively known as calyx, while the petals are arranged in such a way that are referred to as corolla. So, whereas the sepals are arranged and known as calyx, the petals are collectively known as corolla. So let's take a look at the diagram of the hibiscus flower, what we call the common flower parts. This is the diagram of hibiscus flower. So from here, we can see that this is internal structure. This is internal structure of the flower. We're going to call here, these two parts are called the stamen. Now let's start with the stamen. The stamen is an extension from parts of the flower. The stamen is made up of the anther. This anther contains polygrains. These polygrains are like semen. We're going to be looking at it as we continue to progress on this. So why this is the filament? So when we compare these two structures, you will see that there's a relationship between it and the human reproductive organ. At this point, this brings us to the end of this lesson. Do hope to see you in our next lesson.